John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. It's fantastic to be here with everybody this afternoon for this panel discussion on truth and consequences, COVID, climate, and national security in the age of Trump. Very exciting to be with my two brothers. Just so people can get the answer, my younger brother, Sid Cash, and my older brother, Steve Cash. They'll be introducing themselves. I also want to note, I'm assuming, because I have not gotten a cell call from her, that my mother and Sid's mother and Steve's mother is on this event as well.
So be nice to us, so she'll come after you.
Exactly, exactly. It's great to have you here, Mom. And just so the crowd knows, if there's anything that the brothers do really well today, it's because of her. And if we mess up, it's because of us. It's particularly nice to have my mother here because as this is at the McCormack Graduate School at UMass Boston, our mother also had a long and very impactful career, mostly at the City University of New York, in New York, where she was taught English and struggled in the same kind of way with the challenges that public universities have. So, Mom, it's great to have you here. Also want to thank their other family members. When I looked at the registrations last week, almost about 10% of the crowd was going to be family. So we have some cousins and I think an aunt and uncle or two, and our kids are here as well. So it's great to have everybody here. And then just lastly, before we get started, just want to thank Rochelle Straker and Jack Lee on our staff here at the McCormack Graduate School who have made this happen. So thanks very much. All right, I'm going to start just by introducing myself, and Sid and Steve will as well, and then we'll jump right in. As I said, I'm David Cash. I'm the dean here. I've been here for 5 years. Prior to that, I was in state government, Massachusetts state government, where I worked on creating science-based, evidence-based policy to address a whole range of environmental problems. The premier one was climate change, and worked at developing a whole range of different kinds of nation-leading programs in Massachusetts. It was very exciting. And prior to that, I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where I worked on my academic work, which was looking at the role of science in environmental and energy policy. Sid.
Hi, I'm Sid, the youngest brother. Shouldn't get that confused. I'm an associate professor of neurology at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I am both a clinician and a scientist. I spend part of my time seeing patients with neurological disease, primarily epilepsy, and the remainder of my time running a laboratory that investigates function of the nervous system, how the brain works, and how the brain doesn't work in pathology, and coming up with ways to try and ameliorate those problems. A lot of my research involves technology and moving technology into the clinical domain. Stephen?
So my turn. I'm the oldest brother. I'm Steve Cash. I am by trade a lawyer, but I've taken a few digressions, one of which is most important now. I spent a fair amount of my career not practicing law, but at the Central Intelligence Agency, where I was an operations officer focused on first counterterrorism and then issues relating to former Soviet Union and the Balkans. And after leaving the CIA, I then went to Capitol Hill, where I was a staffer on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and Senator Dianne Feinstein of California's chief counsel, focusing on terrorism, technology, homeland security, and intelligence reform. So I spent a lot of my life thinking about the national security community and that part of it, which is focused on intelligence and how it works and doesn't work, and its characteristics, often in discussions with my brothers, because as you will hear, there are interesting parallels and differences between my trade and their two trades.
Excellent, thanks. And just so you know, in terms of rules of the road today, we do not have a moderator for this. It's just the three of us. We had at one point considered having my mother moderate, but that just would have just exposed too much family dynamics. And so in order to put questions, you can see at the Q&A button on your Zoom bar, your toolbar, and you can just post a question there. All three of us will be monitoring those questions throughout. Each of us will take about 10 minutes to talk about truth and consequences from our particular area. And then we'll have a discussion at the end that we hope is lively, animated, and we can all learn something. We're very excited about that. So this, as Steve sort of alluded to, recently, or maybe not so recently, but certainly in this administration, as we have seen questions about truth and evidence and science be brought to the fore in conversations about how this administration has dealt with a whole range of issues, it became really clear that in our three areas of environment and climate, in healthcare, and in intelligence and national security, there were really what seemed like very similar mechanisms going on with how evidence was treated, how truth was treated, how science was treated. And we thought it would be interesting and instructive, particularly at this moment, 1 week before the election, to have a conversation about these kinds of dynamics and what they mean and what the consequences are for those. And I just want to set a really quick context for this, because it's not given that truth or science or evidence is treated in a particular way. But in our country, there's been, and this can be debated and argued about these kinds of dynamics, but I just want to put a really simple frame out there. And that is, after World War II, where I think it was seen that so much about engineering, technology, and science was helped the Allied forces win the war, there was a huge elevation of science for policy. There was a technocratization of policy where we saw in healthcare, in infrastructure, in military, where science was really seen as a solution, one way to solve many of our problems using science. But there were also problems with science. And we also saw this distrust of science right before we all got on. Steve was talking about the movies of the 50s and 60s that really saw science getting out of control, technology and science getting out of control. There were the monster movies and Frankenstein, et cetera, those kind of movies. But there's also this kind of post-World War II nuanced understanding of science, not necessarily as objective, but in a social and political context that can be good and be bad. We know, and this relates exactly to COVID and the vaccine, we know, for example, that there are many in African-American communities that don't trust science and don't trust some aspects of medicine because of the history of how that's been misused in their communities. When you think of the Tuskegee experiments, for example, and there are questions about whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge gets a seat at the table, et cetera. So we get that science and evidence is socially constructed and politically constructed and in those kinds of contexts. But we're seeing something very, very different in this context of this administration. And I'm not going to go into detail here. Each of us have different ways of explaining what's going on in our fields. But what we've seen in the Trump administration in a variety of different ways is a degradation of truth, a questioning of evidence, whether it's through the public degradation of scientists and experts of the science, meaning the science about public health or COVID or climate, and even the contestation of science, just science itself. We've seen non-scientific personnel being put in scientific positions. We've seen advisory committees created by statute to advise lawmakers or regulators that have not included scientific perspectives. We've seen a much greater examples of interested party knowledge outside of government. We've seen regulations designed to include science, now downplaying science, and we've seen just the ignoring of evidence in a variety of ways. You'll hear each of us speak about maybe one or more of these in each of our fields. So with that, let's just dive into Sid and COVID.
Great, thanks, Dave and Steve, for both you setting this up. We'll get into COVID, and I think it doesn't actually require that much actual introduction or discussion. It's so prevalent in the press, the way that COVID is being handled or mishandled at the level of the administration. I think it's rather obvious, but even just recently, so if you go to the next slide, Dave, this was President Trump at a rally just a few days ago, where he was talking about Joe Biden and saying, well, he'll listen to the scientists, saying that as if that is a horrible thing. And then he comes up with the rationale, right? If he listened to it, our country would be in a massive depression. Instead, we're like a rocket ship. And it's sort of amazing how many pieces of that sentence are problematic from a truth and science point of view. Right? He starts by saying we shouldn't listen to the scientists. If we listen to them, things would have gone horribly wrong, for which, of course, there's absolutely no evidence. He portrays it as if science is a single monolithic thing, which it's not. And he then also, makes up a story as to what's actually happening. And I think he's trying to refer to the economy here. Economists could be a whole separate part of this discussion, but I think many would argue that this is not going like a rocket ship, but perhaps he's referring to something else. If you want to go to the next slide, David. We are in fact going like a rocket ship in some ways with respect to COVID. I think everybody on this call is aware of that, particularly in the last, say, week, where our rates have been going up again as high or higher than they were at the worst point since the pandemic started. We're now on our third and now highest peak for the number of new cases. Hospitalizations are rising, and of course, deaths will unfortunately follow this. So this is the actual data that's out there, but data that is constantly being attacked at all levels, but particularly by President Trump. And so we'll go to the next slide, just a blank slide. And one of the things that's happened, and I think one of the major consequences of this sort of unrelenting attack on science, and in this case, on medical sciences, on doctors, on the healthcare establishment, is that it has completely eroded trust in the typical organizations that would be relied upon in this environment. So for example, the CDC, many of the people in my profession a year ago would have said, if there's ever a problem with any sort of pandemic, infectious disease, we have the CDC. The United States has the best infrastructure for dealing with this. And now if you ask me that same question, I cannot give you that answer. The CDC has been completely hollowed out in a way, or at least our trust in it even from us. And so you then see a title like this. This is from the COVID Tracking Project, which is a project that's run primarily by the Atlantic magazine, but also a whole bunch of other news media organizations contribute to it. And this is their title on their main page. Right? The public deserves the most complete data available, but there's no official source providing it. Right? So we've come to a point where science and medicine and information has been attacked to such an extent that we no longer can rely on governmental organizations whose entire design in many ways was to provide unbiased information. We can't afford to listen to that anymore, to trust that anymore. And so now other organizations need to step into the gap. And that's exactly what's happening with COVID. You have this, you have Hopkins, you have a number of other academic and media organizations assembling the information on their own. Now, you can go to the next blank slide, Dave, while I just chatter for a little while. The consequence of this, I think it's hard to be that hyperbolic about it, actually. You know, the fact that we have 220 somewhat thousand deaths from COVID, which is more than any other country by quite a bit, has to, at least in some extent, be an extension of this constant attack on science and medicine. There is no current plan that any of us could point to. There's no consistent messaging that any of us can point to. Our ability to react to this infection, both from a medical point of view and from a policy point of view, has been completely destroyed by the constant attack on science and on medicine and on doctors and on all of the healthcare workers. And it's done I think what's important to sort of think about is the way it's done in a sort of bizarrely two-faced or complex way. So just yesterday, I think it was, and Steve will correct me because he pointed this out to me, Trump said something to the effect that all doctors, or many doctors, or probably all, are liars, and that we are inflating the number of COVID cases because we somehow get money from it. And by the way, for any of you who are skeptical, we don't. That doesn't actually happen that way. But he said that. But at the same time, earlier last week, he was crowing about how the physicians were so great and so amazing with helping him with COVID, and all doctors and nurses and healthcare workers are heroes. And he'll go back and forth on this, and he'll do the same thing with science in general. Scientists are great, except that they can't be trusted, and information is important, but it can't be trusted, and only I have the truth of it. And it's eroding all of the structures necessary to combat this kind of problem. Now, the interesting question, one of the interesting questions is the degree to which, and this is especially important in, within 7 days of the election, is to what extent is this an irreversible harm that's been done, and can it be counteracted in some way, either in now or going into the future? And I'm not sure. I think that if you look historically, and there's many people who have written about this from the sciences point of view, from social sciences, in the media, et cetera, as Dave talked about with respect to since World War II, there have been ups and downs and different relationships with the American public to doctors and scientists. In general, the trust in doctors has been declining since the late 60s and early 70s. That's been fairly well documented, but not to the extent where it's being attacked here. That trend has continued and maybe accelerated in certain aspects since Trump came to office. In a 2017 YouGov survey, for example, something like 35% of respondents, only 35% of people had significant trust in scientists. And the number of people who had no trust at all in scientists and doctors increased by over 50% from a poll conducted only 4 years earlier. So there are some trends, but they're not all in bad directions. Dave, if you can go to the last slide here. This is from the Pew Research Foundation, looking at US adult confidence in various different professions. And actually, scientists and medical scientists have remained fairly constant at fairly high levels, according to this poll. Now, media, business leaders, elected officials are lower and traditionally have been lower. And so there is some data out there that suggests that this constant attack hasn't necessarily completely eroded public confidence in scientists and how scientists communicate, but it's not totally clear. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to try and shore that up and respond to these kinds of attacks in a way that gets us back to a state where we could talk about information in a relatively neutral fashion and use that to come up with actual medical policy or other policy. And I'll end here and let Dave give you a similar story, perhaps in the climate zone, before we take questions and open it up.
Great. Thank you, Sid. And that's exactly right. I mean, in a way, I kind of feel like I could just substitute climate for every time you said COVID, and substitute climate scientists for every time you said doctors or medical professionals, because it's been a very, very similar story. And one of the themes that I think is good to open up for discussion is why. Why is this? Where do we see this happening? What does it have to do with the politics or the desires of the president? So if I go back to the original list of mechanisms, I've made these a little bit more specific to climate. So we've seen this, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. We have seen public degradation of climate scientists and experts. A lot of contestation of the climate science is a hoax. We've seen non-scientific personnel in what has been historically scientific positions. NOAA stands for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So in Sid's story, it's the analog to the CDC. It's the premier climate science organization in government. We've seen in the Environmental Protection Agency, advisory committee scientists, members being replaced by members who represent the fossil fuel industry, for example. And we've seen greater expertise from the fossil fuels auto industry being used in government now. And then interesting changes in regulations. Often regulations have been a bulwark against the misuse of science because it often pretty clearly rules within regulations. But one that the government has changed, which is a really interesting one because it sounds good on the face of it, but has actually been very damaging, is something called the transparency rule. I think as many of you know who do research at large data research, is always a concern to protect the identity of people who are represented in large data sets. And what this rule does is basically say any research that's been done with data sets where the names and other identifying information hasn't been made transparent and clear, we cannot use that data to set the rules. So as a simple example, if there was a research project that showed the impact of particulate matter on a data set of 20,000 people, and the scientists refused to give up the names of those people, as they should, because it's an important part of the integrity of the scientific process, the regulatory agency, EPA, can throw out that science and not use that science in the setting of the standard. So it's been a kind of twisted way that changing how science is used has advanced an agenda within the administration. But again, along the lines of what Sid says, we've seen this, although it's been in the 4 years that Trump has been here. For COVID, it's only been the last 8 months. We've seen a relentless push within the Trump administration to change how science is used, whether it's in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, EPA, et cetera. And this is from today's paper. So as we're preparing for today's talk, this flew across my screen, and I figured I would have to use that because this article is a kind of compendium of what they've done addressing science. We've seen it even in something like this, which was a late night, comedy routine fodder, which is the Hurricane Dorian, where someone added this extra Sharpie illustration to comport with what the president had said, that the hurricane was heading toward Alabama, even though there was no scientific evidence that there would be any major impacts. And what happened, not only was this kind of joked at, but there were serious repercussions for the scientists. There were several scientists who tweeted after the president claimed that Alabama would be hit, tweeted that, no, don't worry, Alabama, you don't need to evacuate your homes. And those scientists were reprimanded. So that's, again, creating a culture of fear within the scientific organizations that had not been there before. This was one of the most remarkable. There was during the wildfires when in California, when the president visited California, they held a press conference, and one of the Californian scientists, I think in the California Fire Service, was talking about how climate change was creating the conditions that increased the probability of the kind of wildfires we were seeing here. And the president said something like, well, it's going to be getting colder. I don't know what he meant by that, but perhaps that winter was coming. And the scientist responded, well, science says that the climate is going to be increasing temperatures in California, particularly during this time of year. And the president responded, well, I don't think science knows, actually. So again, a public statement like that, sure, there will be some of us, and I would venture to guess most of us who are in this audience today, who would say it's ridiculous for a president to be saying that. But for many in our population, look at this, and they're looking for a trusted figure. The president is a trusted figure who is making these claims about science that then results in people, again, in Sid's case, people not wearing masks because they're not trusting the science, or people in the climate not being that concerned about climate, and so politically not galvanizing to make changes. This is, as I mentioned, where there's industry or interested parties that are doing research. There's a long, well before President Trump, a long history, as was true in the debates over smoking and the health impacts of smoking, of industry producing science or denying science, even though they knew about it for a long time. And we've seen this as this has been uncovered in many different areas. And then I just wanted to, part of this conversation is about consequences. And if we had looked at the beginning of COVID, a graph would look very similar to this. That is, in February and March, there weren't that many cases, but then they started spiking up. That took only a couple of months. But if you look at what's happening in climate, it's taking decades and decades. And the questioning of science, one could argue, has the consequence of us not responding. And so we're going to see, in this case, global surface warming. But you could make a chart like this on sea level rise, on increased hurricanes, on droughts, on disease vectors, on many different areas that have a similar. And we're at this point, like we were in March and April, where had we used science, we might have averted some of the worst consequences that's described. We see a similar kind of thing here, where, and if I just chart some of the questioning of science, this is 2013 was the first time that Trump called climate change a hoax. Sorry about that, I'm just figuring out. In 2017 and to the present, they've been cutting the role of science and EPA and the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And here's just the example that I gave before of I don't think science knows. actually. So we're at this inflection point in the climate change story where if we ignore the science in the way that these public pronouncements are pushing, we can see, we're not bending the curve in the way that we needed to bend the curve for COVID. We need to bend the curve for climate. The question is out whether or not we're going to do that, given that, in fact, the consensus in the scientific world is that we have about 10 years to take significant actions on climate change. And if we don't, then we're going to see these consequences proliferate. All right, I'm going to end my part there. Steve, over to you.
Okay. You can take the slides off because I'm not using any slides.
Okay, I'm dead. Okay, I will do that.
As you would imagine from my background, we don't like to put things in writing. So I'm just going to talk without slides. And I'm going to start in a tradition of many discussions I've had with my brothers by beginning that by saying, I think they sort of have it wrong. And let me explain what I mean by that. They're obviously right on the science issue, but I think the issue is broader than that and perhaps more important than that. And I want to illustrate it from my world, which is in many ways very different from the ones that both my brothers live in, but has some important parallels. So first, let me give a preview of why I think it's bigger than science is the problem. The problem is what's being called into question is the concept of truth and the idea that there is an objective reality out there that through various arts and sciences can be discovered, assessed, articulated, and then acted upon. So I come from a different world than the science world. I come from the intelligence world. So I'm going to give you like a nickel tour. Some people do know how it works. I do come out of the CIA. And what we do has some analogs to the scientific exercise. So I'm going to explain what the CIA does through that lens and then talk a little bit about why I think it's being damaged and what that means for all three of our professions and the country. So what do spies do? We, like scientists, we collect data. We observe the world. We have an important part of our trade, or what we like to call is tradecraft. The term we use is collection. And that involves looking at the world and bringing back that information. In the case of where I come from, the focus is on looking at that world through a lens of human beings who are giving us secret information, the people who are recruited as spies. Human beings tell us things, and that is what we collect. And in some ways, that's the analog to Sidney looking at his machines or David looking at temperature graphs. We talk to people. We have other mechanisms as well. We can look at things from the sky and satellites, and we can listen to signals and the like. But basically, we report on what the world looks like to us. Now, a major difference between what we do, particularly with humans, that Sydney and David don't have to deal with that much in their world, is the expectation that the sources of our information are often lying to us. They are often not trustworthy, and part of the art and maybe science and tradecraft of intelligence collection is figuring out, is that data good? Now, Sydney and David both deal with bad data too. Bad data comes from bad people, or at least lying people. But then there's a second part of what we do, and that's the analytic function. Full disclosure, I came from the operations side. I'm not an intelligence analyst, but I work very closely with them. And what the intelligence analysts do is take all that collected information, compare it and correlate it to all the other information that's available out there that doesn't come from secret channels, and attempt to put that into a form. And it could be a briefing, it could be an intelligence report, a written intelligence report, and provide that to policymakers who are going to make key decisions in national security. In the way David was talking about climate policy, that's a little bit like when the scientists tell an elected official, look at my graph. And the graph David showed would be a pretty good one. See the inflection point? We have to move the curve down. Here's where my data comes from. And that's essentially what the intelligence community does for policymakers on the national security front. A side note here is, interestingly enough, both COVID and climate change are scientific enterprises that are increasingly having national security implications, and actually, to some extent, fall into my world as well as theirs. And that's been an interesting juxtaposition. So what's the problem? Well, it's always been well recognized that intelligence does not always get it right. And it is sometimes corrupted and it sometimes fails. But so there's efforts in science that don't call it right. And sometimes it is corrupted and sometimes it fails. And in fact, I think most historians of science would tell you that part of science and part of intelligence is offering up hypotheses that end up being disproved. So what's happening with this administration? This administration, to an unprecedented extent, does not appear to be interested in using the product of the intelligence community to inform the policy decisions. What kind of policy decisions? Should I put sanctions on China? Should I increase our military presence in the South China Sea, or should I decrease it? Is North Korea actually going to decrease its nukes, or in fact increase its nukes? A host of questions like that. And increasingly we see, again, similar lines from the president and from people around the president that, again, David said, I could take COVID out and put in climate. I could take COVID and climate out and put in Russia, because it's almost the same. It's like Mad Libs. It's almost the same thing. I can't trust the people doing the analysis and talking to me. They're either stupid, or they're corrupt, or they're deep state, or I know better, or I just simply know better. There's the president's famous statement about, I know more than all the generals about terrorists. I know more than any of them about terrorism. And the idea of saying to the American people, and I understand that my world often doesn't get as much transparency as the scientific world, but still it's out on a public, in a public platform, and certainly the decisions are. Americans care whether we're going to have a war or not. And what we've seen is the president calling into question not only the people who provide the intelligence, but the basic concept of whether it is possible to know what the world is. So he has said repeatedly things like, who was responsible for the death of Khashoggi? Was it the Saudi Arabians? It's impossible to know. One can never know. Did Russia interfere in our election? And he is repeatedly saying things like, well, Putin says X and the intelligence community says Y. It's not really possible to know. Echoing a lot of what you've heard in climate science, for instance, which is, yeah, sometimes scientists say that curve's going up, and I've heard about scientists that say that curve is going down, and I'm smarter than the scientists anyway. I think the curve is staying the same, or I guess in California, it's going down. It's going to get colder. But the fundamental change that's happening, and why this is different than that first slide David put up about changing views of science, and frankly, changing views of intelligence. And I certainly know that the public's view of my home agency has changed in many dramatic ways over the since the end of the Second World War in 1947, when the agency was created. What's different, it's not a degree of increased or decreased skepticism about the talents of people in my world and in the scientific world, or increased skepticism about the capabilities of those people, or even the honesty of those people. It's increased skepticism of the underlying enterprise, which is, at its core, a firm belief that there is a knowable world out there. It is aspirational to know it perfectly. We obviously won't. But much of human enterprise, and certainly the enterprise that the three of us have been involved in, believes deeply that through hard work and an orderly process and a transmitted professional ethic and capabilities, you can get closer to knowledge of the world. And what's being called into question is whether that is even a possibility. And I think in some ways, that's what this election is about. And I'll sort of leave you as we head into the election with asking you to listen to the things, go on the chats on Fox News or watch Fox News. And the things people are saying about what they think this election about often appears completely divorced from reality, but in a way that embraces being divorced from reality. And it essentially is questioning the idea of whether one can understand reality, whether there is a truth. At the agency, its motto, it's on the floor of the agency and on the walls of the agency and on the coffee cups, is "Speak truth to power," which is actually a biblical quote. And the issue's always been, do you have the courage to speak truth to power? And frankly, I don't think in my profession, people have really given thought about the idea of what if the people you're speaking to actually don't care about truth? Not that they disagree with you. They don't believe in truth. And that's where we are now.
Awesome. Thanks, brothers.
So you see, I was right. You guys were all wrong.
That's always been the case, Steve. Always been the case, except for when it's not. So we got a whole bunch of really good questions here, and I'm going to try to pick some of the ones that are kind of spanning the three of us to take a crack at. But in the spirit of relying on evidence and the right answer and truth, I just got a correction here from my old colleague and friend, Susie Moser, who said, you might recall when I pointed to the person who talked about the California wildfires as a climate scientist, not a climate scientist, the Secretary of Natural Resources Agency in California. So obviously he's someone, as Susie says, who very much respects the science and as he's trying to manage the wildfires. So thank you for that correction. So here's a question from Anita Miller, colleague of mine here at UMass Boston. Hi, Anita. And this is sort of at the core of why we're even talking about this, or what's the alternative to what we're saying, and that is, can we talk about what you think the motivations or why politicians don't want to trust experts? And you could talk about that in the immediate, or you could talk about what's changed over time. Let's try to keep our answers kind of quick because there are a whole bunch of good questions, and I can start with that. And I mean, I hate to say, I think there are obviously a lot of factors, and there's another great question about uncertainty that we're going to get to, and how do we understand risk and uncertainty? And we'll come back to that question. But there's so much about the climate story historically that's been driven by fossil fuel interests and the political power that fossil fuel interests have. So it's not a surprise, for example, that slide I showed about GM that was hiding data for a long time, or the influence that fossil fuel industries have. And it just seems that fits very well within the narrative that this particular president is having of wanting to keep things the way they have been. There being a great America that there had been that he's trying to restore. And I think that's a very simplistic, but it's a huge core part about why climate scientists, not science, not just by Trump, but by many others, has been ignored.
Yeah, I think that this is a really great question, and I'm going to hand off to Steve very quickly on this because I think he'll have more to say. But I actually think that here's where COVID and maybe the intelligence community response is a little bit different than the climate change. I think climate change, I think Dave's right. Everything I know about it is there are motivations, there are motivating forces that are sort of counteracting, financial and so on. I'm not sure, actually, why the president has been the way he has been since the beginning with COVID, right? It's sort of interesting in many ways. If you could imagine a situation where very early on, and he likes to tout his China closing policy, which was not, but early on, if he had said, yeah, this is a real danger, boy, he could have really run with that. He could have said, this is a horrible danger. China, my arch enemy, is a liar. I'm going to shut them down. I'm going to save everybody. We're going to devote unbelievable resources to this. I'm going to end up giving a bunch more money to my friends, but you don't need to know about that. But he could have approached it totally differently. And this election would look totally different if he had, but he didn't. And I'm not sure that there is a clear motivation behind it, except that there's this history that he amplified of basically disagreeing or shooting down any expertise at any point in time. It's sort of an automatic contrariness in a way. And I wonder if that was the motivation, but I actually don't really understand it. Steve might have a different perspective, or a political scientist might understand it better.
I think there's three reasons, and only one of them is directly Trump. And the first is, and this is unfortunate, increasingly the product of a lot of science and the product of a lot of the intelligence community is in some ways not good news, particularly on these big ticket items. It's not a breakthrough, we've come up with a new great drug. It's not a, look, we can go to the moon. It's you have to change your life and not drive your car as much. And so at least a sense of, it's sort of like, it's your mother telling you to clean up your room. Sorry, Mom. The second is, there's an inherent tension between people in power and people in our three professions, because the core aspect of our professions is, again, that adherence to truth and a method to get to truth, which doesn't make the practitioners particularly susceptible to the world of politics and the world of power and the world of influence. Most scientists, I think, would say, you'll get the results that I get, and you'll get the conclusions that I get, and I don't really care what you think. And that is what most intelligence officers, at least aspirationally, would say to a politician. And the third is Donald Trump, who has, I think, capitalized on the first two, and realizing, and then also realized, and among the many norms he's broken, perhaps the most important is he realized what a empowering aspect, an empowering thing it is to reject truth as a necessary aspect of your everyday life. It is a sort of, in the Marvel universe, it would be a superpower of a villain, just a willingness to not care about truth. I think those three things together are the perfect storm that we're in right now.
So somewhat related to that, here's a question from Ezra Hausman. Oh, cousin of mine, family member. Okay. He says, science and intelligence have inherent uncertainties and things that do change with increased evidence. CDC said not to wear masks early on. There's questions about that. Sid might address that. But in general, how can we make the public comfortable with uncertainty, but still to understand the importance of trusting science? Sid, do you want to take first crack at that?
It's a really hard question. I think that this has been looked at by lots of people, philosophers and political scientists and neuroscientists as well. Human beings and in general are not good at understanding and calculating probability. We just don't do it well for various reasons. So I think it's an inherently hard thing to do, is to understand risks and benefits and how that can play out. So I think there's that. And then, of course, it's very easy to muddy those waters, right? It's very easy to say making everybody wear masks somehow will lead to incredible joblessness, right? That's the connection. And so when I think in the context of this conversation, it's not only that there's this real difficulty with understanding and portraying and talking about risk, there is the fact that that's a complex discussion to have, which has overlaid on top of it a very easy set of misinformation, right? Or a very easy way to make connections that don't exist. And that, I think, becomes the real battle in this context. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think I'm trying to highlight what the real problem is. I think that if this had been handled differently, we could have had a real discussion about what are the risks to the economy and to homelessness and to joblessness and to suicide rates and so on, if we are to shut down for a certain amount of time, versus what's going to happen in terms of the number of people who get sick and deaths and so on. They were not unlinked. They are linked. There's no question about it. But very early on, the decision was, we don't want to talk about the truth of this. We're going to lie about how many cases there are. And we're also going to denigrate anybody who is suggesting that there's a downside. So, if you were someone who said, we really need to sort of lock down more carefully because otherwise this will get out of control, you were also labeled as someone who didn't care about the economy, or didn't care about people's professions, or didn't care about people's livelihoods. And that was never true, but it became part of the misinformation that makes it impossible to discuss those risks and benefits in any meaningful way.
Uncertainty is a well understood concept in the intelligence community, and people talk about it all the time. Communicating uncertainty is, I'm positive, the name of a course given at the agency to its analysts. And it's a hard thing to do, but Sydney's right. People are not particularly good at it. On the other hand, two observations. The people to whom the intelligence community communicates most of the time is not the American people. It's not everybody. is a self-styled, well, it is an elite class of decision makers. It's your highest elected officials, military officers, appointed officials. It's their job to be able to talk about uncertainty. And in my experience, they're actually pretty good at it. The problem is any thought about uncertainty requires you to accept the idea that there is something, there is a truth out there. There's something on the other side of the probability analysis. But if you don't care about what's real, and if it doesn't matter what the truth is, you can't begin to think about uncertainty. Now, I will add one other thing, which is more in the sciences than in my world. People are very bad at uncertainty. I think that may be hardwired. Sid, there's a neurological project for you. But I think we're really bad at teaching it, particularly in the sciences, both the hard sciences and the soft sciences. I mean, I'm sure everybody here has had the discussion with somebody who said, it's the theory of evolution, so that means it's uncertain, so it doesn't exist, that kind of discussion. We need to be better as a country in teaching the underlying concepts, and probably at the elementary school and high school level, to allow people to do a better job with uncertainty.
So I could just add a little bit to both of those, completely agreeing how difficult it is for lots and lots of reasons why uncertainty is difficult for us to handle. But I actually think in the climate realm and in the environmental realm in general, scientists and policymakers have really shied away about talking about it because it's confusing and it's really difficult. The one example that's kind of interesting to track is how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the large international body that has studied climate change for almost 30 years now. And every 4 years, they come out with a very large assessment. And the language that they use on each part of the assessment has changed over time. And I wish I had the compendium of them listed in front of me, but it's gone from using language that's very circumspect about what their conclusions are to lines that have captured what the uncertainties are, but explained them in a way that shows that there's greater and greater certainty by the scientific community about what's happening and why it's happening. And I also think in a political dynamic, it's just really difficult. Politicians are punished by failure. And probabilities show that things don't always work out as planned. And here's a really small example, but within the climate realm. In the early part of the Patrick administration, when Governor Deval Patrick first became governor, we set aside a lot of money to make investments in innovative technologies. And one of them failed spectacularly and made the front page of the Globe. It was a solar panel company that had designed a new technology to use. And then the change in price in silicon made it that technology not competitive anymore. It was designed to deal with a high silicon price. And he got raked over the coals politically for it. It was damaging. And his perspective, and he articulated it well, was that there is a role for government to be investing in these kinds of innovation because the private sector won't, but it's a probabilistic venture. And that if you are investing in these high risk things, there's going to be a certain percentage of time that the company goes belly up. It doesn't mean the program failed. Same problem, by the way, with the Department of Energy, with the recovery funds in 2009. And politicians get punished if they take probabilistic actions and it doesn't turn out the way that they're hoping it does. And so that adds to the problem. Okay, we have a question here. You're going to love this, Steve. I'm not sure, Sid, that you knew this guy, but we've got a question from an old friend who went to summer camp with us in the 1970s, David Mindell. I don't know how you got on this list, but he writes, "Hello, Cash Brothers. Could you possibly predict or share how all of this political destruction of science, I'm assuming, might be reversed if we vote in if a new administration comes in? Your old Woodstock friend, David Mindell." That's hilarious. All right, so what can correct this? You touched on this a little bit, Steve, and Sid, on the irreversibility of this. What could happen that would make this better?
You want me to take that first?
Yeah, go ahead. You can start, Steve.
Well, I mean, I think it's on the ballot. I think there's a pretty stark choice.
Yeah, but what's going to happen if, let's say Biden does win? We know that if Trump wins, the three of us will be back here in a year talking about it's continued to go downhill. If Biden wins, how do you get people to trust, or the legislative branch to trust, et cetera?
The reason why I say it's on the ballot is I think Biden's talking about exactly what he will do. And,
Okay.
and that is what I think needs to be done. And there are a few things, and some of them I think are fairly easy and are being offered up as a choice and will become real. And the first one is articulating that you actually believe in the concept of truth and of science and of expertise, and that you plan on embracing it. There's going to need to be a fair amount of investment of time, energy, and money to replenish the stock of people who have abandoned government as a place in which you can pursue the truth. There will be a lot of tender loving care that's going to be needed to people who don't trust anymore. That's both in the public and who do work for the government. We're going to have to restructure and recreate a lot of the entities that were built up by Republican and Democratic presidents for the last 30 years, which have largely been dismantled. But I'll leave you with the other thing is Americans have to think about what we're talking about today, and step back from the tumult of what's been the last 3 or 4 years, and perhaps think back to high school science and the scientific method, and allow their politicians to work in a world of probability, particularly in the sciences, particularly in national security. But it's not going to be easy.
No, I
That's
agree with everything that Steve says, and I hope that's what happens. I actually have I don't know if it's a positive thought or a negative thought or a dangerous thought. One of which is, I think, particularly in my realm, but I think it's a test case. What happens with COVID in the next 6 to 12 months could actually have a big impact here. If Biden comes in and, reestablishes various committees that existed and should exist, and starts to rebuild the CDC, and gives Fauci the National Medal of Honor, which he probably will, or something like that. If he takes all these steps, and COVID continues to rage unabated and waxes and wanes, and kids don't go back to school, and next summer comes and we're basically the same place we are right now, then I think we're in an even deeper problem, because now we would have gone back to arguing that experts matter, truth matters, science matters, and there isn't a lot to show for it. If, on the other hand, he does those things might not matter so much, but if COVID manages to wane, the economy is doing better, people feel more secure and more normal in their lives, then I think that alone would have made a large dent in this narrative, and be able to let politicians say, look, we're going to trust the experts, we're going to use the experts, look how well they did when we were really in the tubes. I don't know if any of that will come to pass. It's something I think about and wonder how that'll play out.
great. I'm going to go on to another question. This one is going to get us, I think, a little bit outside our comfort zone, so that's exciting. This is from Jenny Stevens, an old friend and colleague of mine who's now at Northeastern. And she says, denial of science and disinterest in truth, in quotes, are characteristic of patriarchal controlling leadership. Are any of you optimistic about the potential of, quote, growing the squad and embracing anti-racist feminist leadership as a primary strategy for prioritizing investments for the public good? Now, this is 3 white men who are going to attempt to answer this question, Jenny, and I know that's why you put it to us. I could take a first crack at it, because this is, part of this answer has been in the research that I've done on what makes science used and useful and believable, and certainly, and therefore creating better public policy, better public goods. And there's a large literature now that shows that the more perspectives, for many cases, not all cases, for the more perspectives at the table, the more ability that the institutions and the organizations have to bring in voices that have formerly been marginalized. And if these are voices of color, if these are gendered voices, et cetera, then having those perspectives, those truths at the table will lead to better public outcomes. And I have a very short story about that in which this was totally true, having to do with the placement of, I think it was a bioterror research center at BU that was going to be situated in a part of Boston that was a community of color. And the way it was first advanced was a very classic traditional way in which there were not voices from the community at the table. And a kind of bogus risk assessment was pushed through to show that this thing was safe. And I was in state government at the time, and we stepped in as a kind of part of the permitting process, and we forced them to create a different system and different setup in which different voices were brought to the table. And then a more robust risk assessment and risk process was done. Eventually, the research facility was built, but it had definitely much more engagement with the community and support of the community by the time it was. That's just one example. So I think there is, I mean, I'm optimistic as we see the sciences getting more diverse, not fast enough, but that is happening. And so really great question, Jenny. And I know Sid, you want to take a crack at that too?
Sid, you can go first.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Yeah, so I think that anything that increases the number of different players and the perspectives of different players is a system that's more likely to be willing to discuss and argue about and entertain different points of view. But I don't know what that does, or I don't know if that necessarily argues for a primacy of truth per se. I don't know if that's inherent in that. I'd like to think that it is, but I'm not sure that it is. Those might be two different things, or they might be related in ways that are not totally clear cut. So I'm hopeful that as we head toward greater diversity and more voices in medicine, in the sciences of all sorts, that helps restore or increase the respect for those. Dave mentioned very early on the generally lower trust in the medical system by minorities, and for good reasons. And obviously part of that is the fact that minorities are very poorly represented within medicine and within the sciences. And so it's very hard to trust a group that you don't see anybody part of that looks like you or acts like you. So I think there's reason to think that as we make up these real shortfalls in our diversity with women, with the minorities, etc., that will help restore confidence in science and restore a sense or increase a sense that there are objective truths, or there are things that we should be pursuing as truth. But I'm not sure that necessarily follows, and how we could help aid that is an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock. So here's what I'm going to suggest that we do, because there's still a whole bunch of awesome answers. And by the way, those of you who look on the chat, because our Dean of the School for Environment, Bob Chen, wrote down this chart that shows virtually certain, greater than 99% chance, extremely likely, 95% chance, very likely, 90%, et cetera. Look at that. That's one kind of numerical way of thinking about communicating probabilities and risk. Here's what I'm going to recommend, that we open this up. Rochelle, anyone who wants to leave, leave. We said 5 o'clock. See you later. We've had a lot of people who wanted to meet my mom. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is, Rochelle, can you make everybody a co-host now? And for those who want to stay and continue this conversation, I think Sid and Steve and I have a little while we could stay to continue the conversation. We might even get, I'm not sure if she's going to be here, Sid, but Sid's wife, Ann Gao, is a doctor who's been working more directly on COVID things. So she might have some great things to say. And
you already pointed out that I was mistaken or forgot. Fossey actually already has the Medal of Freedom once for his work on AIDS. I forgot about that.
Yeah,
that is interesting.
Right, from
Okay.
Bush.
So
Bush.
can I take on about
wait 1 second. So Rochelle, I didn't hear you, but if you can make everybody a co-host so everybody can see each other, that would be great. And particularly if Phyllis Cash, hey, Mom, it looks like we don't see you. Is there, oh, that's because you're on your computer probably, right? All right. So,
Oh,
oh,
there
there
she
she is. All right.
Yay.
Wait, unmute, Mom.
Just say
How's
hello.
that?
You have the floor, Mom. Say hello to folks.
Well, if you work hard enough and you give up your life and you have everything in your world is for your kids, this is what happens. They grow up and they become wonderful men. And I grow up and I have wrinkles and gray hair. That's the lesson.
Perfectly put. Perfectly
true.
put.
Scientifically
Hey,
proven.
Mom. And so, Rochelle, if you can make everyone else co-host, that would be great. So anyone who wants to stay can come on, and we'll see if there are other questions or a whole bunch of really other good questions. You're getting thanked for your wisdom, Mom. Can you read the chat, Mom?
Yes, I can.
All right.
I have a very smart audience.
Yeah, it's true. All right, let's see.
Very thought
Want me to
provoking.
take on the percentages?
Yeah, sure.
I'm glad you raised that. I mean, that's been a battle within the intelligence community, I think for 45 years, maybe more. Whether or not to put on intelligence products a statement of certainty. It's sometimes called a confidence statement, including whether to assign numerical values. It's been done a few times. There's a lot of opposition to it. I think the view is that it implies in that world a degree of precision that's inappropriate. I would be hesitant to ever say to anybody that I believe country X is going to do Y at 66.4%. Others think it would be helpful, if only because busy people could read it quickly. But the issue of discussing and understanding uncertainty and, again, to use confidence levels, has been a hot topic within the community and also among intelligence consumers, the people who make those policy decisions, with some wanting it, some demanding it, and some rejecting it.
Great. So let's.
Hey, Mom, you may want to go on mute.
So I'm just trying to see if there are other questions here. Mom, of course, you're getting a lot of shout outs for your wisdom. You know, that's par for the course there. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting one. Lisa Capone, an old colleague of mine from state government who is a media specialist, asks, what responsibility do you think social media platforms have for enabling the swift proliferation of doubt sowing about science, truth, legitimate news media? And should they be held accountable for righting that wrong somehow?
Somebody?
Steve?
Did?
Dave?
I'm definitely, and I actually, Lisa, if you want to unmute and talk about this, if you have thoughts about it, that'd be great, because, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, social media platforms have been like an ability for people who have not had platforms to have access to media and production of media and all
David,
kinds of
can you
things.
ask everybody to go on mute? Because now we're.
Oh yeah, everybody should go on mute. Wait, hold on.
Please, no, it won't work if everybody goes on mute. I'll moderate it.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's been, an important thing, I think, for democracy and for voices. And we can think of lots of situations around the world where, as Steve used the term, it has been used to have truth fight power. And we've also seen it's Pandora's box, that there's and I don't know the answer to this actually, but there are ways obviously that it's allowed for the distribution of misstatements and untruths, et cetera, that have proliferated in a way that leads to a QAnon, for example. So I'm definitely, as you know, a strong pro-government regulation to protect public goods, and because the market won't protect it is a good thing. But I'm not quite sure how to deal with this. It's a really good question. I don't know, Sid or Steve, if you have other thoughts on that.
Well, Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with social media, particularly media like Facebook or Twitter, where so much of the action is now, is inherent in the concept is a rejection of some of the ideals of our professions, which is the idea that it's collaborative with an orderly peer review, that there is a method to the science, as opposed to if you can type 240 characters, you can have an opinion on viral load transmission. And that's problematic. David's right. I mean, it certainly has opened up the ability to communicate to a tremendous amount of people. It's removed barriers of entry. We can all self-publish. We could have the transcript of this event tonight up on Twitter and Facebook in 5 minutes at zero cost and available to pretty much anybody in the world. I mean, literally hundreds of millions of people would have it available. I don't know if 100 million would watch. So I don't think there's an easy answer to it. And I'm not sure what responsibility we would expect social media companies to have to deal with those issues.
That's it.
No, I don't have much to add. I'd be very interested to hear what Lisa has to say, who actually thinks about this, I'm sure, deeply. I think it's a real conundrum that how do you, the sort of technology and our ability to communicate has exceeded the speed with which we could sort of internally and societally regulate it to some extent. And we get into these situations where these platforms have an incredible ability to divert your gaze and put you into an echo box very quickly. And it makes it hard then to break through with actual information and actual results and actual truth. I think that they are inherently designed to do that. And I don't know if there's a way to overcome that easily at this point.
Lisa, can you unmute and do you have a comment? Okay. Nope, you remuted.
Okay, here I am.
There you go.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is great. Hi, David. So I think it's extremely troubling I am in communications, public relations right now, but I'm a former news reporter. And I just think that it's, people do not have an understanding of what the media is anymore. A lot of media is entertainment, and it's very difficult for people who don't have a sort of foundational understanding of how news media people are trained and the editors and the fact checking that goes into it. They don't understand that process. It's very difficult for people to discern one from the other. And I think it also goes to, I don't think that civics is taught universally in high schools anymore. So people also don't understand what the government is. I think it's just, I find it pretty troubling and worrisome, and I don't have an answer either, but I do feel that there should be some responsibility on the part of companies that make their living allowing conspiracy theories to just spread and spread and spread. And Mrs. Cash, nice job.
There are a couple of questions here on the international dimensions of the things we've been talking about. We've been talking mostly about domestic politics, et cetera, but one of our faculty members, Maria Ivanova, has a question: what will be the impact on the standing of the United States internationally if Trump remains in the White House? And I'm assuming along the lines that we're talking to. There are a lot of ways we could answer that question. Let's start with the national and international security expert, Steve.
Yeah, if you take the slide that David showed at the beginning with the upward curve, flip it over. I think that would be your answer. Our standing in by every source of information that I have, and in every respect, our standing in the international community has dramatically diminished. We're not trusted. We're not predictable. We don't seem to have a coherent policy other than the most bumper sticker of statements like America First, which even that doesn't seem to be particularly understandable by our partners overseas and our enemies overseas. And we have largely denigrated the concept of alliances and the idea that nation states and subnational organizations sometimes have allied interests, sometimes don't have allied interests, that they can cooperate together roughly analogously to the way people cooperate together. It's an anthropomorphic conceit, but it has worked certainly probably since the late 1600s to one degree or another in most parts of the world, with some dramatic and obvious failures. But we seem to be calling into question whether that concept is even there anymore. Allies are not important. And with that, I think we've significantly damaged our standing overseas. And in a Biden administration, I think it's going to take a long time to rebuild it. A breach of trust, even if it is attributed to one leader who's replaced by a second leader, runs deep. It runs deep in the national psyches of other countries. Their politicians will have to deal with it. It's not good.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that this isn't in isolation. The things that we're talking about, I think Trump and the administration might be the most egregious practitioner of this, but this is not by no means isolated. There's many governments that are, in one extent or another, waging some sort of battle against transparency and science and information. And primarily, I think those would divide along lines of totalitarian or near totalitarian states versus not, to a large extent. And what does this do overall? I think it emboldens those leaders elsewhere who follow a very similar pattern as Trump, or vice versa. And I think that makes it very hard to deal with the kinds of problems we're talking about, whether they're security problems that Steve has dealt with respect to terrorism, or obviously climate change or COVID. These are not national issues. These are international issues, and our ability to deal with them is greatly impeded by the fact that there are multiple Trumps out there, and Trump-like people, Trump-like governments that are doing their best to fight against expertise and science and anything that contradicts their narrative.
Great. I have another question here, but you should also know the question and answer tab has been disabled because we all went to co-host. You could put questions in the chat, and maybe we'll take some hand raising too. If you want to click the hand raise thing, you might be able to do that. I have a question from our Associate Dean, Kiki Adozi, and it goes to the question of political science, or whether we're believing in science or not. It says, is the question really about non-belief in science, or is it that people at all levels, from lay to politician, are willing to politicize science, knowledge, really, to their own ends?
I mean, you can find examples of both in both directions. I think it's more politicization of science or scientific inquiry. I don't think it's certainly not new. Maybe it's at a state now that's higher than it's ever been before. But I agree with Steve that there's a more fundamental attack here that goes against, hey, we're just going to twist this and spin it so that it comes out the way we want. It gets to something more basic than that. That really is, really problematic in a larger way than simply this is politicized in a particular way. And that's again why I find it sort of interesting and depressing the way Trump handled COVID, because he could have turned it into a success in a way, and by politicizing it the right way, right? He could have politicized it and used it to his advantage, but he didn't. And I have to wonder if that's because of this underlying basic attack on any of the pillars of expertise or knowledge.
Yeah, I think another way to think about it in the climate realm, you could think about politicization, or you could think about interests of people. They're pretty similar in some ways. And I think one of the arts of where climate policy has advanced effectively, it's where the outcomes of the policy and the way it's framed are done in such a way that it's consistent with the interests of the populations trying to meet. So like it's often framed, and I think rightly framed. And in fact, as Lisa Capone can tell you, we were really intentional about it in the Patrick administration to always talk about our climate policy as an economic policy, as a policy that was going to save costs, grow jobs, grow the innovation economy in Massachusetts, because that was consistent with whether people believed the science of climate they're going to make a decision if but I still need a job. I still need to, get things for my kids, et cetera. And so climate, we're in a very lucky position, particularly now with climate, with the cost of solar and wind coming down, that it's a clear economic winner and will be a clear economic winner, which, by the way, sort of the way Sid is describing why Trump didn't jump on the chance to use COVID for his political ends, the same. It's like he's been seeding the clean energy economy to China and India and Germany and Denmark, instead of playing to one of the United States' strengths, to be a leader in innovation and technology. It's been a kind of bizarre, it seems like for a businessman, it's always kind of, I've scratched my head about that. So why don't, for the last 15 minutes or so, let's just open it up if people have either questions or comments. Probably the best way to do this, since there are 50 of us here, is to use the raise hands thing in the participant. I believe that's, if you can't do that, somebody chat me and let me know, but I think you can raise your hand and then that will all come in order and all that kind of stuff. So if anybody wants to, is that working? No,
David,
it doesn't work. It doesn't
before
work.
somebody raises their hand, I want to say something about politicization. I wanna make
Okay,
a
go ahead,
distinction there.
Steve. And then,
I think it's unfortunate that has become a dirty word. It's actually a term of art in the Intel community, and there it is a dirty word, but it's come to mean something more. And I want to divide it in half and actually give a cheer for some sorts of politicization. But what we mean by politicization is that our politicians are going to make policy decisions in our form, in a democratic forum, which involves political discussion between political actors. That's democracy, even when the policy is one we don't like. So when you see, for instance, after a school shooting, inevitably somebody says, because somebody will introduce a bill to say we really should ban X weapon, and somebody will say you're politicizing that. And in fact, yeah, of course, that's what politics is. It's making decisions based on external realities, like a bunch of kids were killed in the school. That's different than what I think we've seen in this administration particularly, which is it's not that they want to make policy decisions based on the science or intelligence. They want to change the findings of the science or intelligence to fit a preconceived political decision. So don't tell me Russia interfered in our election. I want you to tell me that it was Iran and that they were supporting Hillary Clinton, because I want to say that to accomplish a political need. That's a very dangerous politicization. Yeah. I do think we are intentionally, the president has muddled those two things up. Yeah. And again, by muddling them up, it calls into question whether the inputs, the scientific inputs, the intelligence inputs are valid at all. It's just politics. Yeah. That's what politicians do. And we're all part of it. And so there is no way to know because everybody lies. And that's deeply troubling.
Yeah. So if you want to speak, actually what you do is just unmute and speak. Oh, come on. Someone's got to ask a question that will get us to argue.
David, this is Tom Gloria at Harvard University. I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
I posted it into the chat, so I'll verbalize it for the three of you.
Go ahead.
As I try to, as best I can, prioritize my graduate students in the field of sustainability, in this ever accelerating world, what are some of the things that we should really stress for our next generation of leaders?
What should we stress in terms of skills, or what should we stress in terms of how they approach the world as leaders?
Maybe put it in a characterization of skills, knowledge, and then let's say character and ethics.
I'll give one right now. Every political science major who's thinking of a career in political science or in politics should have to take a history of science course and a statistics course.
Okay, and I'm going to say, I'm going to raise Steve one and say every engineer, natural or social scientist should also be taking a political science courses or something like that. I heard of a program in state of Washington where all of the PhD engineer students, I think it was at University of Washington in Seattle, had to spend one semester interning in the state legislature. And I think one of our problems is we still, despite a lot of work in the last 3 or 4 decades, scientists do think that they have the objective truth, and all they need to do is do their research and throw it over to the policymakers, and the policymakers will use it. And that's just not the case at all. And so I think that kind of understanding, I think would be critically important for future scientists.
Yeah, and I sort of corollary to that is I think there needs to also be an increased emphasis on communication skills and communication abilities. And that's actually happening. That's now part of a lot of training programs within the biological sciences, that there's an expectation there'll be a component having to do with communication. It still tends to focus a lot on communication to other scientists, but more and more it's also focusing on how do you actually communicate better to the lay person or the non-scientist or the person outside your field. And I think that gets very much to what falls in line with both what Dave and Steve are.
And
So
I
I'll
would
throw
say
one
at this
more in.
time,
Bring civics back to high school. Civics should be part of everybody's high school.
and I would say, just to kind of go back to Jenny Stevens, and there's someone here named Sophie Cash. Oh yeah, that's my daughter, who had a similar kinds of questions about, I think what's really important in terms of leadership moving forward, whether it's leadership in science or leadership in government, is really taking on the systemic issues that have plagued this country: systemic racism, sexism, where we have not empowered huge classes of our society. We have not empowered with knowledge, with training, with education, with access. And it's really hard to think, particularly in this ever-changing world and ever-diversifying world, that any leadership is going to be successful in decades forward without taking on those kind of structural issues. So I see Porig O'Malley.
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I love these 3 brothers and mom. I think a new syndrome, the clean out, your mother says clean out your room syndrome.
Yeah, it's an age-old syndrome.
There has been a recently released study by the University of Gothenburg in Sweden across 28 countries. And one of its major conclusions is that the Republican Party has, over the last 2 decades, and increasingly during the Trump administration, become increasingly illiberal, like the parties that run autocratic countries, a la Hungary or whatever. And it seems to me that this should be obvious to us all at this point, because the first thing autocracies do is they ensure that all their anti-democratic procedures are in fact legal. And the first way you do that is you stop the judiciary. And no better example of that than yesterday evening with the supposedly independent judiciary, Supreme Court, where you had a new Supreme Court justice being introduced by the President of the United States from what is becoming one of his favorite places, a balcony, a la Mussolini. Yeah, so that's one part. The second part of my question is, also Freedom House, which studies the state of democracies, has published another very disturbing study of a continuous and accelerating decline in democracy around the world. And the overall question I would ask is it democracy as we practice it? And given our experiences with COVID and the anti-mask and people being unwilling to change their behavior, is it up to the task of bringing about the monumental changes in behavior and life that will be required if climate change temperatures are to be kept below any workable level?
Steve, why don't you go for the autocracy?
Tie it all
question.
together.
No, wait, David?
Yep.
Well, I mean, the short answer to your second question is and I believe this passionately, is yes. But I expect you want to hear more than just yes. I think over time, democracies have proved to be able to make decisions in an orderly way to address some of the most difficult problems in world history, and with a fair amount of success. It is a messy system. It's a frustrating system. But I don't think autocracies have done a much better job in most cases. So my bold statement of just a simple yes is a little bit of, I have to confess, faith-based, which I'm not comfortable with, but at least we'll confess to it. But I think that the idea that we are so in such pain as a country now may be a testament to a certain amount of underlying health. I'll leave it to Sid to talk about the person who comes into the ER and has no reaction to anything. Probably not a good sign. Am I right about that, Sid? So the fact that this is hurting so badly may actually be good. That said, I think the two reports are probably accurate. We're in a really dangerous time. And I think we could be heading towards a Hungary style or a Serbian style or a Russian style autocracy. But the rejection of truth and the rejection of science is a path there. I don't think that's a characteristic of it. I think that was in somebody's question, that's unique to autocracies. But I think it's a path that this particular potential autocrat is taking.
I have a thought about that that's more of a dilemma, and I don't think I have an answer to it. And again, it's based on experience in state government. So here's the story. As many of you know, there was a proposal in the early 2000s to build a wind farm off of in Nantucket Sound. And it was a brutally long, painful, messy, as Steve said, democratic process of permits and stakeholder engagements and lawsuits and all of the things that many of us think are great about our democracy, that can protect people from large businesses or bad mistakes by the government. And this went on for 12 years. And in the middle of it is when Patrick administration came in. We tried to do things to advance permitting. And I remember at one point, I think it was in 2007 or 2008, so we were in like year 7 of the permitting for Cape Wind. China announced that they were going to do an offshore wind farm. And within, I think it was 12 to 18 months, it was built. So here we had an autocratic country that made a decision that we agreed with, that was move toward doing actions that will abate climate change. And that wind farm is just one story. You could take solar development, electric vehicle development, et cetera, public transportation. China has been far ahead of most other countries, but it has been partly because it's not messy. It's a relatively not messy dictatorship. And so when the Chinese government decides to build a huge wind farm, it happens. And so again, we have this urgent problem, this urgent crisis of climate change, and we have this problem of the importance of spreading democracy and freedom in whatever messy way those mean, and those can sometimes conflict. And again, Porg, I don't have the answer to what would happen there, but or what the right path is, but I would lean toward doing this democratically. That's how I would lean toward it. But a democracy in which, and even a system of capitalism that's very well regulated. And I think that's where the problem has come, that there's a perception in our country of the free market, which just does not exist. And I was just amazed the other day. There was comments by some Republican lawmakers who were saying we should take away the supports for the wind industry because government shouldn't be supporting this. Let the fossil fuel companies compete. And of course, the fossil fuel companies have been getting hundreds of millions of dollars of US subsidies for 100 years. So leveling that playing field and allowing the market to flourish within a regulated environment that protects public goods and protects public health, I think is definitely the way to go. Okay, we're past 5:30, so we're like a half hour past where we said, you can imagine how long our Thanksgiving discussions go just based on this. We haven't even brought up the flying squirrel debate that happens in our family. That is purely a scientific debate about
We have
whether
a
they
vote on
fly, whether they
I'd like
fly
to
or
hear.
glide. You know, we're going to let you guys discuss that after. But I want to thank everybody. Again, I want to thank Rochelle and Jack. You guys have actually stayed longer. Appreciate it. Made this all work great. I appreciate all of the folks around the table here, the UMass Boston colleagues, old state colleagues, and old camp friend. Oh my goodness, family, friends, people from Sid and Steve's sphere are here as well. It's great to see all of you and be part of this discussion. Thank you so much. And oh yeah, thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom.
All right.
Great.
Bye,
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody. Thank you.
It was great, guys.
Thank you.
Well,
See ya.
bye-bye.